woman.
Hello, everyone. Welcome to the advanced training module on legal aspects of open source, in which we are going to explore open software, open hardware, and open data licenses. Open source projects typically use licenses that ensure that software, hardware, or data remains open. There are various types of open source licenses, which we are going to explore in details in this module. Understanding licenses is crucial for anyone working with open source projects, whether you're a developer, contributor, user, or a business entity. Licenses determine the terms under which the open source software, hardware, or data can be used, modified, and distributed. They provide the legal framework that ensures the project remains open and to govern how others can interact with it. A solid knowledge on intellectual property rights and licensing is required to normally follow this lecture. Participants with a poor understanding of intellectual property rights should firstly listen to the basic legal module on open licensing. So this module explores the legal aspects of open source technology, and listening to this module and participating to it, you will better understand the underlying issues of the open source legal aspects. After the completion of this module, you should be able to understand the idea of open source movement, explain the connection between open source and licensing, describe and explain different types of open source software licenses, open hardware licenses, and open data licensing, and describe legal issues in open data licensing in general. Okay, so now let's briefly dwell into the basics of open source. Open source means that content like a computer program, a technical solution, or any other innovation can be shared, used, studied, and changed in a non-exclusive way. In contrast with proprietary intellectual property rights, which restrict users in terms of their usage, modification, and distribution, open source intellectual property allows free access and customization. This openness is made possible through the use of open, we can also call them free licenses. Open licenses do not mean, however, that everything is allowed. Open source licenses, of course, include also obligations of the licensee towards the licensor. On top of that, it has to be stressed that open source does not just mean access to the source code. In order for a license to be considered as open source, the Open Source Initiative formulated 10 principles which must be met for a license to be called open source. Crucially, any license that does not conform to a single principle of the OSD should not be considered an open source license. Acceptable conditions for open source licenses regard the attribution of contributions or rights holders, share-like clauses, retention of copyrights, notices, technical restriction prohibitions, non-aggression, and similar. Open source licenses can be classified in two main categories: permissive licenses and copyleft licenses. Permissive licenses grant maximum freedom to use, modify, and distribute open source solutions with minimal obligations. All derivative works can remain proprietary. Permissive licenses include Apache, Meat, and BSD licenses. On the other hand, copyleft licenses require that all derivative works be distributed under the same license. They promote sharing and further development of open source software. Examples include GPL, LGPL, and EUPL licenses. So this was a brief explanation of basis of open source licenses. Let's now continue with open source software licenses. Software, meaning computing programs, can be protected by copyright, which protects literary works. Functional aspects of a software that meet the criteria for patentability may also be protected by patent. The absence of a license does not make a software freely available to use. Unless it has been explicitly and validly placed in the public domain or falling under copyright exception, using code without a license may be considered copyright infringement. The four freedoms of open source software are the freedom to use or to run the program for any purpose, the freedom to study how the program works and change it, the freedom to redistribute copies, and the freedom to share improved copies. The 10 principles of open source must all be met for a license to be called open source. Any license that does not conform to even a single principle of the OSD should not be considered an open source license. Those principles regard the freedom of redistribution, the source code, derived works, integrity of the author's source code, discrimination, distribution of license, restrictions, and technology neutrality. We already explained the permissive and copyleft licenses. So here on this picture, the most common open source licenses are shown, from permissive with no restrictions to code use to copyleft on the right, where the source code must be available under the same copyleft terms. On the following 10 slides, the most common open source software licenses are described. For each of them, there is a link on the right that takes you to the full text of a license and a detailed explanation for each license. Please read those licenses carefully and visit the links in the yellow circles on the right side. So after this excursion into the world of open source software licenses, also other licenses have to be mentioned. These licenses were not designed especially for software projects, but rather for other kinds of creative works such as websites, scholarships, music, film, photography, and literature. Well, such content can also be incorporated in software projects as video games, for example. So they should be mentioned, and these are Creative Commons licenses. There are 6 different Creative Commons licenses which allow different levels of openness. The Creative Commons licenses website has a license chooser tool, there's a link here, that can help you create a license for your work. Although there are 6 types of Creative Commons licenses. The 3 below are the more encountered in free software projects. The link to each of these licenses is also provided on the right side, so you are invited to explore them in more details. Now let's move to the license compatibility. When a software project combines 2 pieces of code or merges code from one into another, the question is whether the licenses of each software or code allow or prohibit this combination. If the licenses allow it, the licenses can be said to be compatible with one another. License compatibility is a legal framework that allows for pieces of software with different software licenses to be distributed together. Incompatible licenses may result, however, in copyright infringement. The common open source software license compatibility chart is presented here. Any arrow from one box to another box means that you can combine software with these licenses. To determine the compatibility between licenses, you can also use the Join Up Licensing Assistant tool. The link is provided here in the yellow circle on the right side. The GDL tool checks the compatibility based on many crucial classifications like obligations, permissions, prohibitions, interoperability, laws, and support. Open source software licenses are primarily copyright licenses, but many of them have expressed and implied patent licensing built into them. Software patents are exercised over the functionality in which the software is intended to work. In principle, it is independent of the code. So, if someone distributes free software and holds software patents, an absurd situation may arise where parties may use, study, improve, and share the software code, but at the same time they are prohibited from using the software by the software patent. Patent grant terms and defensive termination provisions of recommended free software licenses are shortly presented here and here. So, how to choose an open source software license? We advise you to use the license chooser tool. The link to it is in the yellow circle on the right side. You can share the most suitable license according to your preferences regarding the sharing improvements, keeping the license simple, and community engagement. Let's move to the open hardware licenses. Open hardware refers to physical devices and products whose design specifications are publicly available. This means that anyone can access, modify, distribute, and manufacture the hardware based on these specifications. In contrast to open source software, there is a bundle of diverse intellectual property rights that may apply to open hardware, such as copyright, patents, utility model right, industrial design right, and trademarks. To address these legal challenges, carefully crafted licenses are designed specifically for hardware projects, such as the CERN Open Hardware License, OITAL, TAPR Open Hardware License, and SolderPad Hardware License. But also, some other licenses can be relevant to hardware, such as Creative Commons CC BY SA or New GPL license, MIT license, and Creative Commons CC BY 3.0 license. They are explained in the following slides. For each of them, there is a link on the right side of the slide that takes you to the full text of the license and a detailed explanation for each license. Please visit those pages and study those licenses carefully. At the end, let's explore open data licensing. Data means factual information in digital form used as a basis for reasoning, discussion, or calculation that can be transmitted or processed. Database, however, is a large amount of information stored in a computer system in such a way that it can be easily looked at or changed. Database can be regarded as intellectual property and may be protected by a sui generis database right, which is covered with a special EU database directive. For open data, the before mentioned licenses can be used, mainly the Creative Commons licenses. However, using traditional licenses for the distribution of data contains several problems. The traditional open source software licenses contain irrelevant terms or terms that are difficult or even impossible to adhere to with respect to data. In addition to this, data interacts with software differently than software interacts with other software. So, during recent years, there have been several initiatives aimed to tackle the problem generated by the use of free open source software licenses in open data licensing. The Open Data Commons project provides a set of legal tools specifically designed for open data. These licenses include the Open Database License, the Public Domain Dedication and License, and the Attribution License. The Open Data Commons Public Domain Dedication and License is a tool designed for creators and publishers of data who wish to dedicate their works to the public domain, effectively waiving all copyright and related rights that they may have in the data. The link to the PDDL license is in the yellow circle on the right side. We also have to mention the Montreal Data License and the Cryptographic Autonomy License. Their aim is to build a more standardized, transparent, predictable framework with ambiguous language, a framework that would resemble free open source software licensing. It aims to clarify concepts and tools for the use of data in artificial intelligence and machine learning. So, thank you for listening to this module. Please take a look at the additional materials and reach out if you have any questions.